Alright guys, so this is your homework help video for 3.5. I'm just going to go ahead and go through every problem. The reason being we're not going to have time in class to go over this homework assignment on this upcoming Wednesday. So I'm just going to go through them all and you guys can fast forward to whatever questions you need help with. Okay, so let's go ahead and start here with number 1. So the first thing we need to do is pick 3 points for each one of the pieces of this piecewise function. And as you know, we always start with the boundary point first, and then we pick numbers that are in the actual interval. So for the first one, we're looking for numbers less than -1. So starting with -1, and then picking numbers less than that, like -2 and -3. Whereas in the second one, we're still starting with -1, but now we're looking for numbers that are greater than -1, like 0 and 1. Then the next thing we do is we plug these x values into this equation. So I'll plug in -1 first. Order of operations would have us do the addition first, and then the power. And so when I plug in -1, I get 1. You're going to repeat that process for the other 2 points. So if you plug in -2, you're going to get 0. And if you plug in -3, you're going to get 1. Now we're going to do the same thing with these 3 points, but this time we're plugging it into this piece. So if we were to plug that in, we'll start with the -1. We would square the 1 first, and then we would subtract. And I get -1. So when I plug in -1, I get -1. And we will repeat that process for the 0 and the 1. If you plugged in 0, you're going to get -2. If you plug in 1, you're going to get -1. The next thing we're going to do at that point is we're going to decide whether the endpoints are open dots or closed dots. My endpoints are the ones that have the -1 on them. And so that would be this point here and this point here. So for the one on the top, it's an open dot because the inequality does not have an equal sign underneath of it. But for the one on the bottom, it is a closed dot because the inequality does. And now we're ready to go ahead and draw these. So I'm going to start with these 3 points. Remember, you always start at the end point first. So I'm going to start by graphing -1, 1. But when I do, it's got to be an open dot. And then the next point is -2, 0, followed by -3, 1. So we start at the open dot, our endpoint, and we go through and connect the other dots and make like a U shape, which makes sense because that would be a parabola. Next, we're going to do the other 3 points up here. Once again, starting with the endpoint. In this case, the endpoint is -1, -1, and that's a solid dot this time, followed by 0, -2, and 1, -1. And once again, it's another U shape. We start at the endpoint that they gave us, and then we work our way up, and it looks like that. So there's our graph. And we're all done with number 1. Let's go ahead and take a look at number 2. Similar stuff. We pick 3 points for each piece. So for the first one there, we're going to start with -1, and then we're going to pick some x values that are less than -1 because it says x is less than. So that would include things like -2 and -3. And for the next one, we have 2 boundary points to include, -1 on the left and 3 on the right. And then we need to pick something in between as well, like maybe 0. Last one, we're going to start with 3, and then we want to pick numbers that are greater than that. So that would be things like 4 and 5. Next, for each of these points, we need to find the y values that go with them. So for the top 3 points up there, to do these ones, we're going to plug in each of those x values to this equation here to figure out what the y values are. So let's start with the -1. I'm going to start by plugging -1 into the absolute value bars there. The first thing you do is take the absolute value of -1, which is 1, and then you add, and you get 2. And you're just going to repeat that for the other 2 points up here. So for this one, if you plug in -2, you're going to get 3. And for the next one, if you plug in your -3, you're going to get 4. Now for our next set of points, we're going to plug these x values into this equation so we can figure out what their y values are. Of course, once again, I'm going to start with that -1. So plugging -1 into there, we get 4 minus -1 squared. You do your square first, which is 1, and 4 minus 1 is 3. You're going to repeat that process for these other 2 points. So plugging in 0, you're going to get 4, and plugging in 3, you're going to get -5. Next, we're going to plug in these 3 points into this equation. Now, what's interesting about that equation is there's no x to plug those numbers into. When that happens, that just means the y value is always -2, no matter what the x value is. So for all of these x values, we're just going to give them all the same y value of -2. The next thing we got to do is go through and decide open dots or closed dots for our boundary points. This is our boundary point. This is a boundary point, and this is a boundary point because of those. And then finally, that's a boundary point. So for those 4 points, I need to decide, are they open dots or closed dots? And once again, it's all based on the inequality. If the inequality has an equal sign, like up here, then you're going to have a closed circle. And if they don't have equal signs, like here and here, then you have open dots. Last one's going to be closed dot. Now we're ready to graph our pieces. So we have -1. I'm going to start by graphing this one up on the top here. -1, 2 is going to be left 1 up 2, and it's going to be a closed dot, we said. Next we have -2, 3. Next we have -3, 4. And remember, you always start at the end point that they gave you, and then you draw a line through the rest, and don't forget the arrow. For the next one, we start at -1, 3 with an open dot. And then we have 0, 4, and then 3, 5. Now that, since we have 2 endpoints, we start at one endpoint, and when we get to the other, we don't do an arrow, we just connect it, and we're all done at that point. Then finally, we have the last one. We start at 3, -2. And it's going to be a closed dot, followed by 4, -2, followed by 5, -2. And we start at the end point when we connect our dots, and we go, and then we draw an arrow through the other way, and that's the end of that one. So that's number 2. All right, now the next thing we're going to do is we're going to evaluate a couple of problems here. Let me zoom out a little bit. It's easier to see everything all at once. All right, so use the piecewise function from number 2. So we're using this function to evaluate each expression below. So the trick is you have to know which piece to use. Do we use the first, the middle, or the last? And then we just plug it in and simplify. So, for instance, on this one, f of 2, I'm being asked to plug -2 in, but where do I plug -2 in? Well, do I plug it in here, here, or here? Well, it depends on whether 2 is less than -1, between -1 and 3, or greater than 3. So which is it? What interval is 2 inside of? Is it less than -1? Is it between -1 and 3? Or is it greater than 3? Well, hopefully you guys know that 2 is between -1 and 3. And since that's the case, we're going to be plugging our 2 into the middle function this time. And so if I plug the 2 into the middle function, which is 4 minus x squared, I would get 0. Let's take a look at number 4, 8. What interval would 8 be in? Well, 8 is greater than 3, so I would plug the 8 into this equation. But once again, you can't plug 8 into there because there's no x to plug it in. All that means is that the answer is always -2. Next one, we're plugging -2 in. Which piece does it go into? -2 is less than or equal to 1, so we'll be plugging it into the absolute value of x plus 1. The absolute value of 2 is 2, so if you add that to 1, you get 3. Last one, f of -1. Now, this one's tricky because it's a boundary point. And what do I mean by that? You can see the -1 is in 2 spots up here. It's here and here. So which piece do I use, the top or the middle? Well, when you're trying to plug something in, that means you're assuming that x can actually equal that number. So for which of these inequalities can x actually equal 1? Well, that would be the top one because it says x can be less than or equal to. So for number 6, you're going to use the top equation of absolute value of x plus 1. So we're plugging -1 in there. If you take the absolute value of -1 and add 1, you get 2. And that does it. So hopefully that was helpful, and we'll see you guys in class.